Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Codex. Our talks this summer feature graduate students and postdocs who were nominated to speak by their senior colleagues. Today, we have Alex Sietsema, who is currently a graduate student at UCLA. Alex's research focuses on the theoretical foundations of machine learning, as well as the development of new algorithms for specific applications. His talk today will focus on a geometric approach to overfitting. Take it away, Alex.
Hi. All right. So first of all, I want to thank the organizers for having me and want to thank everybody involved with the program. It's been a really cool mentorship program to be involved in, and so I'm just grateful for everybody to have been involved. So today, I want to talk about some recent work in the area of overfitting, and we'll talk a little bit more about what this means in a minute. But this will be sort of a theoretical talk for the most part, but hopefully we'll find some ways to make it a little bit more concrete, and we'll see some nice pictures as we go to sort of set out what some of the theoretical background is. Before I keep going, I wanted to just briefly mention some of the collaborators for this work. So first of all, my former fellow graduate student, Kedar, is now a researcher at G Research. My advisor, Deanna Nadell, who's at UCLA as well. She's also has some joint appointments with UBC. And finally, Guido Montevar, who's a joint appointment at UCLA between math and stats. So today, the outline is going to be, I want to start with an example of what we mean when we talk about overfitting and sort of this broader idea of generalization theory. I'd like to talk about some of the background surrounding that. For our particular problem, we'll set up some assumptions and just some general theoretical groundwork that'll make our proofs work. I'll show you a main theorem, which kind of summarizes what we're doing. And finally, we'll go through a proof sketch, which will hopefully make the reason why the theorem is true clear, even if we don't get too deep into the theoretical underpinnings. So to start with, the setting, for a first example setting, we'll think about this idea of 1D regression. So we have some ground truth function that we want to reconstruct. We'll call this function f. And to do this, I'll give you some observed data points. These are sampled from some distribution. In this case, I'm saying that we're just, picking points uniformly on the line, and we're adding some Gaussian noise to them. So our goal is to reconstruct this green function f from these observed data points. So maybe the first thing that I try is I think, well, I'll just try something very simple. I'll try linear regression. And if I run linear regression on this data, I'll get something that looks like this. So the first thing that we'll notice is that when we run linear regression, we don't fit all of the data points exactly. So I don't know if you can see my cursor. Hopefully you can. But for points like this, we're under predicting what this particular data point was observed as. For this point, we're over predicting the observation for this data point. So we don't fit all of the points exactly. But if we think about how well this model generalizes, so in a sense, how well it fits over the entire input space, it actually does pretty well, right? Over the entire input space, the match between this learn prediction function and the green function, which is a ground truth, is pretty good. We over predict a little bit on the right, we under predict a little bit on the left, but only very slightly. So maybe we keep going in our careers a little bit and we learn about these things called neural networks and we think, okay, well, it'd be fun to take a neural network and try it on data like this as well. So if I fit a relatively large value neural network on this data, what do I get? Well, I'll get something that looks like this. And this is qualitatively different in a lot of ways. So first of all, the thing that we notice is now we're fitting all of our data points exactly. Even though we have noise, we're fitting every one of these data points perfectly. And so we call this sort of a sense of overfitting, right? We're perfectly interpolating our training data. But we also might ask, what does this mean for our generalization error? So last time we saw that our generalization was very good, even though we weren't fitting all of the data points exactly. And here, our generalization is sort of okay. It's not terrible. So where we have a lot of data points, we're actually pretty close to this green function overall. You can see over, especially over here, we're matching things pretty well. In some of these other regions, though, we start to overpredict the function pretty significantly over here. And in some small regions, we also underpredict the true value of the function. So even though now our training error is zero, now we've perfectly interpolated the training data, our generalization has gotten a little bit worse. So if we continue on a little bit longer, we might learn about like interpolating polynomials, Lagrange polynomials. And one idea we might have is now, well, if my goal, generally is to fit my training error as well as I possibly can, well, maybe what I should try is just using an interpolating polynomial, right? That'll guarantee, analytically that I have zero training error. And we hope that this is very good. On this data, if I try something like this, I'm going to get really bad results, right? So again, even though I'm fitting all of my training points perfectly, right? We know we have to be fitting perfectly. Suddenly, this function is a terrible prediction of my ground truth function overall, right? The generalization error is very high. So for example, in this region on the right here, to the right of this data point, we're vastly, vastly, vastly overpredicting the value of the function. It's not even on the screen. And then as soon as I get to the left of it, and now I start vastly underpredicting the function, again, over here, you're vastly overpredicting. And so my generalization is very poor, even though I'm perfectly fitting my training data. And so this sort of motivates the question, right? If I am overfitting, if I know that my interpolation error is zero, how well do I actually how well does my function generalize? Am I in a setting like this where my generalization error is very, very high? Or am I in a setting more like this where maybe my generalization error is sort of okay? So this is kind of, the study of generalization that we like to think about. And what recent work has kind of gotten into is that there are kind of three different types of overfitting that can occur. On the right, we have this catastrophic example, which we've just seen, where our generalization error is very, very high. In the middle, we have this tempered regime where we say maybe our generalization error is not zero, but it's also not infinite. This is similar to the ReLU network case that we saw earlier. But we also have this regime that we call benign overfitting. And in this benign overfitting regime, what we see is that even though our training error is zero everywhere, right? Again, we're interpolating here. Our generalization error is also very small, right? So over the whole input space here, our true function or our predictive function is still matching the true function quite closely. So sometimes we end up in these settings where we can have both zero training error and also very small generalization error. So we call this phenomenon benign overfitting. And this is a very interesting thing to study. And a lot of the recent work is kind of focused around which regimes this happens and which it doesn't. Briefly, from a definitional perspective, I want to talk about what we mean kind of more technically. So what we'll consider in this case is for some given function, if I send the number of training points that I use to infinity, I get catastrophic overfitting if my excess risk, as a side note, we'll discuss risk or regret or generalization error kind of all is the same term. We'll define these more in just a moment. Um, our generalization error will approach infinity on the right here for the catastrophic case. Our generalization error will stay bounded in the tempered case. And our generalization error will approach zero in the benign case as I send the number of training points to infinity. So I also want to give you sort of a sample of the previous work here. I don't think that any of the specific results here are too important, but I just want to give you kind of a sampling of what's out there and the way that people choose to study these kinds of problems. So this analysis was really kicked off, I think, in 2017 by this paper that showed that these deep ReLU networks that we tend to learn in practice do benignly overfit. And from there, it's been studied in a number of settings. So we have settings for linear regression. We have settings for ReLU networks of various kinds, leaky single-layer or two-layer networks, and also for things like reproducing kernel Hilbert spaces. There are kind of two main threads of this work. The first is this idea of overparameterization. So we consider either, vastly overparameterized networks relative to the number of training points we have. I'm giving some of these examples in red. So or we think about these as being very high dimensional. So maybe our data dimension vastly exceeds the dimensionality of the true of the number of samples. So for example, in this recent work, we have, the dimension of the data D is bigger than some n squared log n, where n is the number of training samples. So our dimensionality is very, very large. The second thing is that we have this idea of minimum norm interpolation. And this will be in our setting too, and we'll talk about this in just a moment. But a lot of people like to study minimum norm interpolation. But overall, kind of the way that these results tend to work is that they look at some particular function class. So maybe this is ReLU networks or RKHS. They choose some data distribution, and we look at some type of loss function and optimizer. And under those class of assumptions, we study what kind of overfitting tends to happen. So we'll get to our setting in just a moment. But I mentioned that we study norm minimization, and it's worth understanding a little bit more about why exactly this is the case. So a lot of times we want our models to have certain properties. So maybe this is sparsity, maybe this is smoothness, maybe there are other things that we want to promote. And the way that we often train these kinds of models is that we have two terms in our loss function. We have some training loss term, which measures how bad our predictions are for the training set. And we add some norm term, which gives us some way to penalize these bad behaviors that we want to avoid. Oftentimes, this is a norm of some kind, maybe an L1 norm or an L2 norm. But here we're studying overfitting, right? If we're using a loss function like this, and we assume that our model is overfitting, that the training error is zero, then this simplifies somewhat. So if you think about what kinds of functions these are going to be, well, the functions that we learn are going to minimize this norm, because again, this term is now zero, subject to the fact that our training error is zero for all of the points in the training sample. So this is, norm minimization kind of pops out of doing these kind of regularized type models. You also might remember some recent work about like sort of implicit bias when we train different methods. These kind of implicitly promote different kinds of regularization. So this pops up not just in regularized models, but also in general models based on the way that we train our methods. So a natural question here is if I'm studying this kind of norm minimization framework, what kind of norm do I want to study and what kind of functions do I want to consider this optimization as being over? In our work, we're going to look at Sobolev spaces. So this is where we start to get a little bit more technical. I want to reassure everybody at the beginning, we don't have to worry too much actually about the nuts and bolts of Sobolev spaces for this work. I'll be presenting everything sort of through an intuitive lens as well, but I do want to make sure that I'm giving some of this technical detail for the people who would like to see it. So broadly, Sobolev norms measure the smoothness of functions. And if we want to minimize the Sobolev norm in the sense of this norm minimization, that will promote functions that have some small local variation, so functions that are more smooth. We'll see this in just a moment. For people who are familiar, if you're not familiar with Sobolev spaces, these are the functions whose mixed partial derivatives up to order k have finite LP norm. And the norm in this space is just the sum of all of the LP norms of these derivatives. So if you have large derivatives over the space or a large function value, then your Sobolev norm is high. If your derivatives are all pretty small, then your Sobolev norm is also small. So kind of as an example of this, I have some smoothish green function here, which will have a small Sobolev norm. And if I have some, very oscillatory or very sort of spiky function like this in red, then its Sobolev norm might be very high. And so we'll think about sort of intuitively, this green function is smoother than the red function here. And finally, I'll mention that for all of the following work with this definition, we're assuming that Kp is larger than D, and so pointwise evaluation is well-defined and continuous by Sobolev embedding. That won't be super important for us later, though. Great. So this is why we do norm minimization. To do norm minimization, we'll consider Sobolev spaces for our functions. So finally, we can characterize exactly what our set is going to be. So we're going to look at what happens in overfitting for fixed dimensional regimes. So earlier, I showed you that a lot of the previous work considers these very high dimensional regimes where maybe D is much, much larger than N. For our work, I'm considering fixed dimensional regimes. So we'll fix the dimensionality of the data D, and we'll consider what happens as our number of training samples grows to infinity. So for the function class, instead of considering just ReLU networks or RKHS or something like that, we're going to look at just functions that are in these Sobolev spaces. So Sobolev spaces are WKP with P within 1 to infinity. So what this means is that we're generalizing a lot of these function classes. I'm not giving you a specific parameterized function type. I'm just saying it's one of the functions that exist in this space. It's also worth mentioning that we're studying approximately norm minimizing interpolators rather than strictly norm minimizing interpolators. So instead of looking at functions that have the lowest norm possible, we're looking at functions that will be approximately as low norm as possible. And finally, we're not restricting ourselves to a specific data distribution or a specific loss function. We give some assumptions in the paper, and we say, well, as long as your loss functions, data distribution satisfies some assumptions, then we'll be okay. With all of this in place, our main goal is to show that with high probability, as long as we have enough data and our Sobolev space fits this bound, then approximate norm minimization is going to lead to harmful overfitting. That is, we do not get benign overfitting. Our generalization error must stay bounded below, away from zero, even as the amount of data goes to infinity. In other words, adding more data does not help me get better at generalization in this setting. So that's sort of some of the background, and hopefully this motivates why we're looking at the problem that we're looking at. So what I want to do now is provide some of the actual theoretical setup for the way that we study overfitting in this setting. So that will be part one, and then we'll give the main theorem, and we'll provide a proof sketch of why this result actually pops out of this setup. So using sort of a similar set of pictures, we can sort of think about what we're doing here. We will sample our training pairs xi, yi from some measure on some bounded region, and we choose some loss function to evaluate our pairs with. This is some continuous loss function that's a regression type loss function. So the loss is 0 if and only if we've made the correct prediction. We also will have some Bayes optimizer shown here in green, and this will be derived from whatever measure that we've chosen. So this will just essentially be, for every input, this will be the pointwise infimizer of the loss function in expectation over the measure. So for every input, which point will minimize the loss across all realizations of this y. I also want to point out here that we're going to treat this like it's a ground truth function, even though the only ground truth here that we have is the measure. We derive f Bayes from the ground truth measure, and we treat this sort of as the ground truth function. So with this setup, what does generalization error actually mean? Well, we'll be studying for some interpolator f, shown here in red, it interpolates as it goes through all the data points. What we'll call the generalization error is, given this training set, what is the expected difference between the loss of the function at some point and the loss of the Bayes optimizer at some point? Intuitively, this will end up looking more like sort of the shaded region between the Bayes optimizer and our true function in expectation. So these are the pieces that we'll work with. We make some assumptions about what they look like. I don't want to focus too much on these because they end up being kind of technical, and the actual definitions are not super important for us. But mainly, I just want to communicate a few things. First of all, most of the functions that we're looking at here, so our loss functions, our possible functions, our Bayes optimizer, we're assuming that these things are continuous. We're also assuming that most local properties are sort of regular and that things aren't too concentrated in any one place. So, for example, we want to make sure that we don't find ourselves in a situation where maybe this measure is all concentrated at one point of the input space, and so things just get really, really crushed together at some particular point. So we sort of assume that things are spread out enough and continuous enough and smooth enough that we can analyze these things from some local perspective. A lot of the geometric approach that we're talking about here will come from sort of the analyzing the local behavior of these functions. So the assumptions that we make are sort of to support that. A lot of these assumptions are from previous work, though, so it's not just us coming up with the situation where this works. This is well motivated by prior work. So I mentioned earlier that we were going to think about approximately norm minimizing solutions. So it's worth taking a minute to understand what those exactly mean. So again, we're working here with these Sobolev norms, which measure smoothness. And we see that f star is a minimum norm solution if it solves the optimization problem where we minimize the norm subject to our training loss being 0. So these are minimum norm interpolators. Our class of solutions that we'll consider, our class of functions, will be approximately norm minimizing. So what I'll say is I'll give you first some factor gamma equals 1. So gamma here is going to measure how approximate I allow my solutions to be in terms of their norm. And we call it an approximately norm minimizing solution if the norm of my function is within gamma of the norm of the true function, or the norm of the minimum norm function. So in other words, these approximately norm minimizing solutions are going to be interpolators that are almost as smooth as possible. So with these pieces sort of set up, now we can state our main theorem. So what we'll say is, for this Sobolev space WKP with K within these bounds and N sufficiently large, then with high probability, all of my approximately norm minimizing solutions satisfy this inequality. So this term, this is the generalization error again. So the generalization error will be bounded below by some constant that depends on gamma and depends on the facts of our problem. But crucially, C can depend on anything about our problem except for the number of training points. So again, what this means is, you know, n is sufficiently large means that, as I let my n grow larger and larger, this inequality will still hold. So adding more training data will not help me improve my generalization. I cannot end up in the benign setting where my generalization error tends to zero. This is the main theorem. And this is still pretty technical here, so I did want to give one sort of example of what this looks like in maybe a simpler setting or a more concrete setting. So if instead we consider, a very simple case like we saw at the very beginning. So if I'm using Gaussian noise and square loss, so I'll take some function f Bayes. I'm asserting that this is the Bayes optimizer, and I'm adding some normally distributed noise. And I'm also using the squared loss function, as we might expect. As long as our input distribution satisfies the previous assumptions, using uniform should work fine. Um, then briefly, if I want to know what my generalization error looks like in this case, I can do some simplifications with Bayes various decomposition. Again, I don't want to get too technical here and spend too long on this. But I can make some simplifications, and I can end up showing that my generalization error here is exactly the L2 difference between my interpolating function and my Bayes optimal function over this space with respect to the measure. So in other words, this means that the picture that I showed you earlier of looking at the shaded difference between the two is really sort of what's going on. So I can restate this if I want to with the Gaussian noise and square loss, and say that with high probability, all of my solutions will have bounded below different L2 norm difference between itself and the Bayes optimal function, even as n goes to infinity. So that's the idea of the main theorem. And alone, this is obviously a nice function, a nice theorem, but I'd like to share a little bit more now about why exactly this happens. And we'll actually learn a little bit more about what the underlying processes of this problem are by looking at how the proof works. So I'm going to give you a brief proof sketch here, which will be the remainder of the talk. Hopefully, I can keep this high level enough that it'll be interesting. We'll have a lot of pictures sort of to ground it. But briefly, our strategy is going to look like this. We want to show that our generalization error is bounded below for all of these approximately norm minimizing solutions. The first thing I need to do is understand a little bit better what the minimum norms that I could consider are. To do that, we'll identify an interpolating solution that I can tell you precisely, and we'll provide an upper bound for its norm. Once I've done this, this will bound the norm of any minimum norm solution. Once we have this bound, the next thing that we'll want to do is study how my interpolators correspond to the true function. We said earlier we're going to do this in some local neighborhood. And to do that, we need to look in some neighborhood of our training points, since these are the places where we know that our interpolating functions and our Bayes optimal function will be different. So we'll identify some bad set of points, which are going to be pretty noisy and pretty separated from the other data points. And this will drive our ability to show generalization error. In fact, what we'll show is that around these points, the smoothness is going to force our interpolators to be far away from the Bayes optimal function, and that we get some generalization error. And if we know that we have enough of these points, we can add up these generalization error contributions. We can get a bound that doesn't depend on n. So that's the strategy. So for step one, the way that we're going to build our interpolator are with these things called radial basis functions. These exist a lot in the literature for Sobolev. I think they pop up in Evans a fair bit if you've read that book. But all we're going to say is that these are functions that have finite support, are smooth on that support, and outside of that support, they're 0. Inside that support, they are 1 in a smaller radius, delta over 2, and they interpolate smoothly between 0 and 1 outside of that radius, and they'll look something like this. Now, crucially, we know that these things are going to be in our Sobolev spaces, and this point 4 says that I can quantify what their norm is. So knowing that I have basis functions, if I give you a training data set, it's pretty easy to construct an interpolator. Now all I have to do is just take one of these bumps for each of my training points and just stick a bump function of the right height onto each training point with a small enough radius such that none of the training points kind of interfere with each other. So that'll give us a bump function that looks something like this compared to our Bayes optimal function. And since I know the norm of any of these individual bump functions. This is a sum, and so I can use some concentration inequalities to control the norm of the whole thing. And so in particular, what I can end up showing is that the norm of my bump function will be bounded by some function of n. This will be n to the kp over d. And then because I know that this is an interpolator, this also bounds the norm of the minimum norm interpolator. So overall, what this tells us is that the norm of the min norm solution is in fact bounded by some function of n. I also want to mention that for the remainder of a lot of these results, what we'll also see is some information here on the right about what the Sobolev norm of the various functions that we're considering are. So here I've marked in blue. We're going to call this sort of an upper bound now for the norms of the functions that we consider, right? This is telling us that if I'm looking at a function that exceeds this norm, if this is the min norm, then it can't possibly be an approximately norm minimizing solution. To make sure it's approximate, I can also just add a gamma factor everywhere here. But we'll see more pictures like this in the future, so it's worth understanding exactly what we're talking about here. Ooh. Great. So the next step we said was to look at some subset of our points. So what we want to find now are points that are going to be very far away from the other points in terms of their nearest neighbor radii here in the x direction. And we also want these points to be very noisy. You can sort of see here that if they're very noisy points, and we know that things are smooth, then we should be far away from the base optimal function somewhere around this point. So I'm going to call this the bad set. And so I'm going to identify, based on our training points, some subset of bad data points that satisfy some properties. So first of all, the number of bad points, this is number one, will be some function of n. It's worth noting that this row pops out of the way that we define our noise, but we're not going to focus on this too much. But we have some fixed proportion of our training data set that is part of this bad set. For each of these points, their radii, right, their nearest neighbor radii are going to scale like n to the minus 1 over d. We'll also know that their labels are not too large. This will be important for us in technical ways that we won't mention quite here. But more critically, for all of these points, what we know is that at the data point xi, the difference between the observed label and sort of the true label will be bounded by sigma min squared. This is some function of the noise. And so this tells us that we have enough data points, some proportion of the true, the whole training set, that have radii that are large enough and have observed labels that are far enough away from the base optimal point. So this will be our bad set. So why do we want this particular subset, right? Well, we can make some sort of scaling argument here. If I know that I have some constant proportional to n number of points in the bad set, if each of these have a radius that scale like n to the minus 1 over d, then if I look at some volume of these balls, well, that'll be something of this raised to the d that will scale like n to the minus 1. And if I add the volume of all of these balls up, then this n here should cancel with the volume of the ball, and we should end up with some constant that's independent of n in this case, because these n's will cancel off. So again, we're looking at sort of these balls here. These are sort of very large balls compared to maybe these ones, which are much narrower. And we're saying that these horizontally are very large and they're vertically very far away from the base optimal function. So one more step before we actually start looking at some potential interpolators. It's worth noting that we've been talking a lot about interpreting Sobolev norms as some sort of smoothness. So we were saying that high Sobolev norm means something very spiky or very not smooth, and a low Sobolev norm means something that is very smooth. So what this corollary briefly tells us is that we can view local variation of the function in some ball as being bounded by the Sobolev norm. And so this is, again, letting us pass between local function variation in some ball and Sobolev norm overall. And so hopefully what this will let us do is pass between the two and use local variation to interact with the min norm bound that we've just given. So this is going to be sort of the main point of showing this proof. So I think this is very important to understand. The main question here is going to be, how large can the local variation actually be around this bad set that we've identified? So I've given you some example function here in red. This is an interpolating function, of course. And I want to claim that this is sort of relatively smooth relative to some of the things that we're going to consider in a moment. So its Sobolev norm is relatively small because it's relatively smooth, but its regret, its generalization error is high because we can see we have this like pretty large region here between our interpolating function and our base optimal function. And so like we saw with the L2 picture earlier, this is going to mean that we have a relatively high generalization error. How would I make this generalization error smaller? Well, looking at it, sort of this radius in purple here, I would want to try to shrink it a little bit to make the function correspond better with the base function overall in a larger amount around this point. So if I try something like that, this radius gets narrower. So the regret has gone down. This region between the interpolator and the base optimizer has gotten smaller, and so our regret has gone down. However, our local variation has increased, right? This radius has gotten smaller, and so the smoothness has gone up, right? We saw earlier that, functions that oscillate more tightly are going to have higher Sobolev norms, and so our Sobolev norm keeps going up here. If I wanted to continue this process, right, I might think about trying to shrink these radii as much as possible. Well, eventually I can't do this anymore, right? At the very beginning of this proof sketch, we gave you this bound based on based on that bump function interpolator. And what I know is that if I try to keep shrinking these radii more and more and more, then eventually my Sobolev norm is going to increase beyond this threshold. And even though the regret now is small, we know that because we're exceeding this threshold, that this function cannot be an approximate norm minimizer. There exist other interpolators which have lower norms, and so we know that this is not a valid solution to the problem that we set out. So functions like this are not allowed. And again, you might remember all the way back at the beginning that we saw these pictures of what these benign overfitters look like, where we saw these kind of like small spikes forming. So something like this cannot actually happen in our problem. There's some trade-off here between how much generalization error is allowed and how much Sobolev norm that forces us to accumulate. So based on this picture, what this lets us do is characterize exactly how small can this ball around a given point be without exceeding the Sobolev norm down. What this gives us is something like this. So we can identify some critical radius. So I'm calling this delta crit. This again scales like n to the -1 over d, like we hoped for at the beginning, plus some constants which depend on gamma, but again don't depend on n. And we know that this will still be within the nearest neighbor balls that we talked about. And we know that there's some subset B prime. I'm going to call this sort of the very bad set, where we have two conditions. First of all, B prime is going to be large enough. It's still some fixed proportion of n, which will be at least half of the original bad set that we identified. And second of all, we know that for every point in this radius, any approximately min norm interpolator must be at least sigma min over 2 away from the base optimizer everywhere in that smaller radius. So if you remember earlier, for the bad set, we said just pointwise, this xi compared to the base optimizer is a large distance away. For the very bad set, we're saying for everywhere in the smaller radius, we know that our interpolator has to be far away from the base optimizer. So for example, with this setup you can see here, here's our root sigma min over 2, controlling the distance between these two points, or these two functions, excuse me. And here we have in purple this delta crit. We can see that a function that looks like this, so this is sort of, relatively smooth, this is smooth enough that we don't have our function going inside of this rectangle given by the distance that we've given here. So a function like this might be allowed as one of our approximately norm minimizing interpolators, but something spikier that looks like this, well, this intersects with this region here. And so we know that we can't accumulate points like this overall for all of our approximately min-norm interpolators. If my points look like this, then I know that my accumulated Sobolev norm will be too large relative to the bound that I gave you at the beginning. So we've identified this very bad set of points. We know how large it is, and we know for all of the solutions that are, potential members of potential approximately norm minimizing solutions, we know that they must stay away from F bays everywhere in this region. And so in particular, if I want to bound the accumulated generalization error across all of the points in my bad set, well, I know that this region is going to tell me, it gives me exactly a lower bound on how much generalization error I have, right? This will be at least amount that we get for this shaded region. So finally, what I can do is I can add all of these contributions up. So if we're just looking at the L2 case, I can, rewrite this integral. I can say that this is bounded below by just the sum of the integrals over all of the very bad points. I just told you, we just saw that in this radius around these very bad points, this critical radius, we know that, the distance between our interpolator and the true function are going to be this sigma min over 2. Since this is constant, I can pull it outside. So we're just looking at the volume of these critical balls, which, as we saw in the definition, still scales like n to the minus 1 over d. Or in this case, since we're looking at volumes, the radius scales like n to the minus 1 over d. So the volume of the ball scales like n to the minus 1. This no longer depends on which ball we're looking at. So if I sum up across all of these balls in the very bad set, we saw earlier that this scales like n. And so these n's are going to cancel. And so I end up being bounded below by a constant here that's independent of n. So I can just, fold everything here into some constant c, none of which depend on anything depending on n. So this is how we get to the result that we want. So again, sort of the takeaway here, going back a little bit, is this idea that we have this trade-off between generalization and Sobolev norm. If I want to get better generalization, if I want to make this function closer to the base optimal function overall, while still interpolating, the cost of doing so is that my smoothness has to go down. My Sobolev norm has to go up. So I can't have both smoothness and good generalization at once. I have to sacrifice one of the two. I can't have both. So finally, sort of our conclusions for the future work. We've showed that we have this trade-off and that we have to harmlessly overfit to the training data in this setting. As a practical takeaway, what this might mean is that we don't want to send our training error to 0. So maybe this means some sort of under training. So maybe we want to, only train until we get some small amount of training error, but we don't want to go all the way to 0. There's also this idea that some people might have heard of Morozov regularization or Morozov training, where our goal is not to train our generalization or our training error all the way to 0. We train we train to the level of the noise. If we have the noise known or we can estimate it beforehand, maybe this motivates training to the noise level instead of to 0. But I also do want to mention that another of our results here are that we show that for different Sobolev spaces, so this is going to be k larger, in fact, this will be k larger than 2d over p, that we actually see both harmful and benign interpolators. So this result does depend to some extent on which Sobolev spaces that we choose. If we increase our k, if we increase our smoothness parameter, then suddenly we start to see that we can get both harmful approximate norm interpolators as well as benign approximate norm interpolators. So it's worth pointing that out as well. Sort of overall, though, what we saw is that this proof technique relies mainly on the geometric properties of the problem. So, it relies on showing things about, the local variation of these functions. And this is not unique to Sobolev spaces, of course. And so one of our goals is to extend this to function spaces with maybe slightly less restrictive that still give us some of the bounds that we need to work with here. And finally, we're interested in applying these techniques to sort of classification type loss functions. In the original version of this work, we do have a proof of this for margin one classifiers. We're hoping to extend this more to kind of broader classification problems as well. Great. And with that, I want to say thank you so much. I think we've gone pretty fast here, but I don't mind having more time for questions. If you're interested in seeing more of this work, you can access the paper here. We published this in ICML 2026. And I have some references at the end as well. So with that, I just want to say thank you so much, and I'm happy to open this up for questions.